March 9th, 1996. A Saturday. On the Grand Zambezi, one of the longest rivers in all of Africa, were 7 canoes embarking on a routine safari down its waters. 4 led by tour guides, and behind them, 3 filled with tourists. Leading this expedition was one Paul Templar. A British-born Zimbabwean and military veteran, Templar was aged 28 during the days he worked his dream job conducting tours in his native homeland. Templar had made his return to Zimbabwe after serving in the British Army for a number of years, and when he was back, immediately became entranced by Africa's breathtaking natural scenery and flourishing wildlife. He had fallen in love with his home all over again. Eager to explore as much territory as possible, while also providing others the opportunity to soak in Zimbabwe's beauty, Templar became a safari guide after passing the nation's guide certification program, and from there spent years navigating tourists through the natural wonders of Zimbabwe and the majestic environment of the Zambezi River in particular. For Templar, this was an area that was as familiar as the back of his hand. So when one of his colleagues was forced to step down from leading a canoe safari after contracting malaria, he took their place with no hesitation. Templar was as ready as ever to take this group of tourists through the stretches of the Zambezi, though he recalls beginning his day with a premonition of impending misadventure. A strange sense of dread he had no idea why he was feeling. I could go with the cliche, it was a day that started like any other, but it didn't. It started with a sense of foreboding. You know when you have that feeling of trepidation, like something's just not the way it's supposed to be? That's how I felt. On their journey, Templar and the rest of his group encountered the many forms of wildlife that Africa had to offer. There were towering elephants, elegant lions, fearsome crocodiles, and then there were also hippos. The safari guide was midway through the expedition as his group began approaching a pod of hippopotamuses. Though they were viewing from a safe distance, Templar knew just how vicious these animals were and the deadly implications of moving a tad bit too close for comfort. As such, he instinctively began to tread with caution, attempting to safely lead the rest of the group around the hippos' habitat. Up until this point, the safari went as planned, though the atmosphere would quickly shift from calm to catastrophic when one canoe piloted by tour guide Evans Namasango was suddenly knocked off course. Templar had heard a loud thud as this happened, turning behind him to notice Namasango's canoe flipped over and himself along with 2 other passengers catapulted into the river's current. It was then when Templar became aware of a nightmarish reality. The young guide and his tourists had just been charged at by a rogue hippo, and were now heading straight towards the rest of the herd just meters away. Templar hastily made an effort to rescue the submerged Namasango, but still needed to lead the tourists of the group to a safe location to avoid even further disaster. Thankfully, another guide named Ben was able to retrieve the remaining clients to a rock in the middle of the river that was out of reach of the hippos, allowing Templar to turn back around and attempt to save Namasango. He was now on his way to the site of the accident, planning to quickly stop next to where the fallen guide was and pull him into safety on his canoe, though the both of them were now also fast approaching a large female hippopotamus and her calf. As Templar inched closer and closer towards the jaws of danger, he was now just within arm's reach of grabbing onto Namasango, but the unfathomable chain of events that happened next would change his life forever. I'm leaning over, it's kind of a made-for-Hollywood movie. Evans is reaching up, our fingers almost touched, and then the water between us just erupted. My world went dark and strangely quiet. Suddenly, Templar found himself inside a hippo's throat from up to his waist. From the waist down, I could feel the water. I could feel I was wet in the river. From my waist up, it was different. I was warm, and it wasn't wet like the river, but it wasn't dry either. And it was just incredible pressure on my lower back. I tried to move around, I couldn't. Hippos can grow up to 16.5 feet long, while also sporting monstrous mouths with jaws capable of being opened all the way up to 150 degrees. So, of course, a fully grown adult to them would be a mere appetizer. Templar actually recalls being wedged so far down this hippo's throat that the beast was forced to spit him out, likely due to his particular size. After returning to the surface, Templar caught his breath as he ended up being face to face with a distressed Namasango. He tried to bring the guide back to land, yelling with urgency, "We've got to get out of here." However, Namasango was unable to move on his own and needed an extra hand for a chance to survive. Templar realized this and swam towards his direction once more to pick him up. But little did he know, the rogue hippo was back for more. The creature returned to brutally attack Templar as he was still underwater, first charging at his lower body before repeatedly biting his arms and legs. Templar's body was being thrashed around like a rag doll as he endured pain that you wouldn't even wish on your worst enemy. After what felt like an eternity of agony, the hippo did finally let go, but the damage had already been done. A number of apprentice guides rushed to the scene and found Templar severely injured. He had suffered 38 bite injuries, a punctured lung, and his Achilles tendon had been completely torn out. But most horrendously, Templar's left arm was degloved from the elbow down. Namasango went missing in the waters following this attack, before his body was found 2 days later, roughly 1 kilometer away from where his canoe was flipped. Though managing to escape from the hippos, Namasango had still been stuck underwater with no help in sight. He drowned that day, in what Templar has since deemed a pure tragedy. As for the lead guide, it took officials an unbelievable 8 hours to even get Templar to a hospital that was able to treat such severe injuries. And during this time, many feared that Templar had embarked on his final safari. But by some miracle, Templar ultimately managed to overcome all of this. His left arm did need to be amputated as a result of the attacks, but Templar's right arm and legs were all successfully salvaged following life-saving surgeries. The road to recovery was nothing short of rigorous, but Templar displayed tremendous resilience during this time that assisted him in turning his life around following an otherwise eternally scarring event. Templar now spends his days as a renowned motivational speaker, living to tell his miraculous tale and joining an extraordinary category of people who survived the impossible. Within the immense forests of Siberia, a 3-year-old Karina Chikitova, alongside her parents and their German shepherd Naida, were visiting relatives while on holiday in the remote Russian village of Olam during the summer of 2014. On an otherwise regular July morning, Chikitova was playing outside with Naida and several other village puppies, while her caregivers went about other activities. As she was having fun, Chikitova suddenly noticed her father walking down a path that went out of the village, and innocently decided to follow his lead and see what he was up to. The little girl initially stayed not too far behind her father, who himself was entirely oblivious to her presence. As he continued making strides towards his destination, Chikitova struggled to keep up and was gradually losing sight of her father more and more as time went by. The tiny steps of the then 3-year-old could only take her so far, and eventually, Chikitova found herself stranded in the vast wilderness of Sakha's terrain. Hours passed by as Chikitova's mother and grandmother began growing concerned in the midst of the little girl's absence. And when they questioned her father and learned that she wasn't with him either, Chikitova's family feared the absolute worst. Authorities were immediately contacted and a large-scale search for the missing child soon commenced, which consisted of drones, helicopters, K-9 search units, and a search party of 100 volunteers, all scanning the taigas for Chikitova. The 3-year-old herself faced unimaginable conditions in her time isolated: predatory wildlife, freezing nighttime temperatures, and harsh terrains. Suffice to say, the chances of her survival were slim to none. 2 days turned into 3, then 4, then a week. Chikitova remained separated from the outside world, but she wasn't entirely on her own. As it turns out, the little girl had been accompanied by none other than her loyal four-legged companion Nida the entire time she was lost. Nida trailed behind her as she was following her father, and stuck by her side as she wandered into the dense wooded area. Chikitova's German Shepherd served as a beacon of hope for survival, providing her warmth during every cold night, and fending off attacks from other smaller animals. Although they didn't know where they were, didn't know where to go, and didn't know what would happen to them, Chikitova and Nida always stuck together in the face of adversity, and their tenacity to persevere was just enough for the two of them to miraculously walk out of the woods alive. Nida had been the first to return to the village, capturing the attention of nearby rescuers before leading them back to where the young dog came from. After following Nida through 6 kilometers of tall grass and trees, one of the volunteers named Artyom Borisov finally stumbled upon an alive Chikitova curled up amidst the long grasslands. The little girl was immediately brought back to her family and received treatment for the injuries she sustained. Fortunately, none of which were severe, with Chikitova having only suffered a number of mosquito bites and excessive weight loss. For the exhaustive 12 days and nights, her and Nida were in the forest. Chikitova had lived off berries and drank from nearby rivers whenever she was thirsty. The girl was overcome with emotions as she reunited with her parents, as was the rest of her village, after relentlessly searching for her and never losing faith in her survival. Through all her struggles, Chikitova was as strong mentally as she was physically, and thanks to her loyal companionship with Nida, she managed to escape from the frigid environment of the Siberian woods and make a full recovery following an absolutely nerve-wracking ordeal. Now Chikitova is 14 years old, and has shared even more details on her remarkable experience in a recent interview with the Russian TV show Let Them Speak. Chikitova's incredible display of self-sufficiency at such a young age has resulted in the sculpting of her and Nida's very own statue in the square of Yakutsk Airport, as well as a children's book and movie based on her tale. She has since been accepted into the world's northernmost professional ballet school, and now has aspirations of becoming a healer herself. Born on July 9th, 1823, Phineas P. Gage has been deemed one of the most famous patients in the history of medicine for his body's one-of-a-kind defiance in a mishap that not only resulted in an unfathomable brain injury, but significantly altered how neurologists would even perceive the human brain for centuries to come. Gage, a well-respected and experienced railroad worker, was 25 when he was tasked with directing a blasting rock operation in preparation for a new rail line being constructed in the Vermont town of Cavendish. The foremane's work gang arrived at the scene on the evening of September 13th, 1848. The labor they did consisted of drilling a hole, placing blasting powder alongside a fuse within, and then packing sand and clay above said hole to alleviate the force of the blast with a 13-pound metal bar known as a tamping iron. This work went according to plan for the better part of the day, but during one instance when Gage was packing sand with the bar, the tamping iron made contact with the rock underneath and inadvertently created a spark that reached the powder. The fuse within was subsequently set off. And what happened next was maybe one of the most fucked up accidents ever endured by man. Standing directly in front of the explosion, Gage's face was impaled by the tamping iron as it rocketed from the hole. The bar first entered the left side of Gage's face, drove through his lower and upper jaw, fractured his cheekbone, and then continued upward behind his eye socket and through the left side of his brain before completely exiting out of his skull and landing 80 feet away from the blast. This is where any other case would end, in a tragic, unbelievably grotesque death. But somehow, some way, Phineas Gage didn't die. As a matter of fact, nearby railroad workers who rushed to the scene found Gage still conscious and even talking just minutes after receiving this hideous blow. Though his brain's left frontal lobe had been severely devastated, the tamping iron failed to strike any major veins or arteries critical for Gage's survival. He had essentially experienced a frontal lobotomy on steroids. Gage was soon taken to doctors dumbfounded by his injuries. While he went through alarming periods of falling in and out of consciousness, he ultimately made a miraculous recovery after receiving proper treatment, regaining his strength and returning to work in a matter of months. But make no mistake, the effects of Gage's grisly accident lingered long after taking place, and nowhere was this more noticeable than in the man's own personality. See, before the incident, Gage was hailed by many of his employers as a most efficient and capable foreman, praised for his iron will and intelligence as a businessman. Afterwards was a different story. The foreman was no longer himself in the eyes of his friends, having then grown to be rather profane and even childish. Dr. John Martin Harlow, one of the physicians who treated Gage after the accident, also noted his dramatic personality change during his recovery, writing, "He is fitful, irreverent, and indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom." Scientists estimate that it took Gage roughly 2 years for him to return to his former self, a prolonged period of time, but also contrary to the exaggerated misconception that Gage was forever changed after his tamping iron accident. Although granted, after going through something as hellish as that, who the hell would it be? Still, it was this inconceivable incident that led to integral breakthroughs regarding brain research in the 19th century, as his case led to doctors learning of the relations between one's own personality and specific regions of the brain. In a time when the brain's inner workings were otherwise mysterious, Gage's behavior following his traumatic injury sparked curiosity in the field of neuroscience like a rod to rock. He was living evidence of how the frontal lobe was indeed responsible for personality traits, and remains a vital figure in medical history for this. Gage lived on for an astonishing 12 more years after his accident before passing away of an epileptic seizure at the age of 36 on May 21st, 1860. A death many scientists conclude was in relation to his brain injury. The foreman's skull, as well as the very tamping iron that punctured through it, are now displayed at the Warren Anatomical Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. Do you remember when we talked about Jim Caviezel in the last video and how some people believed him being struck by lightning twice was a form of divine punishment? Well, if God really hated that man, then he must have absolutely loathed Roy Sullivan, a national park ranger who was struck by lightning not once, twice, or even 3 times, but a total of 7 different times, and survived every single strike. And no marketing stunts here. His story is very much authentic. The Virginia native suffered these strikes between the years of 1942 and 1977. Beginning in his early 30s all the way up until his mid-60s. The first recorded lightning strike Sullivan had endured came in April of the former year. Sullivan had been hiding in a newly built lookout tower amidst a powerful thunderstorm in the area. Though this building did even have a lightning rod during this storm, it had still been struck by lightning at least 7 times consecutively. With no protection and conditions only growing harsher, the tower soon erupted in flames. Sullivan was making his escape from the lookout tower as the fire began approaching him. But as he was, a lightning bolt came down just mere feet away from where he was standing. The strike ended up hitting his toe and leaving behind a hole in his shoe, further burning a half-inch strip along his right leg. In July of 1969, Sullivan was struck by lightning for a second time, and in this case as he was driving on a mountain road in his truck. This itself was a rather peculiar phenomenon, as the metal body of a vehicle is typically able to shield off electromagnetic fields, making such an occurrence highly improbable. And yet, when lightning struck some nearby trees, its impact deflected into an open window and was able to knock Sullivan unconscious. His eyelashes and eyebrows were entirely burned off, while his hair was lit on fire. The truck itself remained uncontrolled before crashing at a cliff edge nearby, surprisingly not resulting in a fatal accident. Now, the 70s were very rough for the park ranger, who was struck a total of 5 more times throughout the decade and sustained several injuries on his head, shoulders, chest, and ankles in the process. There was even an instance where Sullivan's wife was struck as well, having been hit as her husband began approaching her while she was hanging clothes in the couple's backyard. As one could imagine, Sullivan's experiences have completely defied all odds, with the probability of being struck by lightning as many times as he was being 1 in 10 octillion. For those curious, that's this many zeros. Though it should be noted that this gargantuan number may not be entirely accurate in Sullivan's case. Being a park ranger, Sullivan was outdoors significantly more often than the average American, and more time outside obviously means more exposure to thunderstorms. The state of Virginia also averages between 35 to 45 days of storms per year, with rather high lightning rates in the midst of all of them. Having quite literally lived an electrifying life, Sullivan soon gained a considerable amount of fame as a result of his accounts, being dubbed nicknames such as the Human Lightning Conductor and Human Lightning Rod, and even being the recipient of the Guinness World Record for the most times a person has been struck by lightning in history. With all of that being said though, Sullivan's personal life wasn't as thrilling as you'd imagine. On top of simply always being in the wrong place at the wrong time and dealing with excruciating pain as a result, many people avoided Sullivan out of fear of being struck by lightning themselves. This isolation led to the park ranger frequently feeling depressed, as even his closest colleagues refused to be near him over an utterly absurd fallacy. For instance, I was walking with the chief ranger one day when lightning struck way off in the distance. The chief simply said, "I'll see you later." After years of suffering socially, Sullivan ultimately went on to take his own life at the age of 71 via a gunshot wound to the head on September 28, 1983. Today, 2 of Sullivan's own ranger hats are displayed in remembrance of his life at Guinness World Exhibit Halls in South Carolina and New York. Frankly, Sullivan should not have been neglected for his experiences at all, but instead revered for the physical and mental strength he displayed in carrying on with his life and his duties as a ranger after the amount of extreme affliction his body took, especially when many others likely would have thrown in the towel after just the first occasion of an accident as freakish as a lightning strike, in the same way as the rest of the figures mentioned. Sullivan's story deserves to not only be marked by unreal circumstances, but also by their inspiring fortitude, bravery, and perseverance. This has been Zen. Take care.